Dr. Professor Joachim von Braun. I'm also happy to say the same for Christian Burgermeister. It's my pleasure to be here at ZEF, University of Bonn, and it's also my great pleasure to see many old friends and others in the audience. I have a board member present here, and I have to be very respectful to him. But I also have Alena Diekman is here. She is a very old friend, and we served together at ICADA, which was one of the centers that Christian did not mention, but I worked there for 13 years, so it seemed like a long time. Anyway, I have lots of slides to show you, so please forgive my enthusiasm, and we will start this particular journey. I will try to convince you about the importance of horticulture for pro-poor development. And the Global Horticulture Initiative, which I'm the chairman of, is represented here. The International Society of Horticultural Science, the World Vegetable Center are the sort of two pins, and then underneath there's a whole range of other centers and other organizations which work together, including now ZEF, in order to try to get the message for horticulture globally out there. And all of us understand about what used to be called the Millennium Development Goals. All 8 of those were contributed to by the Global Horticulture Initiative and also by AVRDC. But we now have new Sustainable Development Goals. If you haven't actually seen this documentation, it's time you did, because you're going to be out of date if you're not operating with these particular publications. And in particular, Sustainable Development Goal 6, which is summarized here. Better balanced diets, environmental protection, women's empowerment, coherent policies at a whole range of different levels. And AVRDC has contributed, GlobalHort has contributed to the creation of this new goal, and we hope that we will be able to service this goal and several of the others in due course. And in particular, we're concerned to make sure that the women's empowerment dimension of the previous sustainable goals is not lost. Women and horticulture essentially go together, and it's very difficult to separate them, and it's something that we have to take on board in our research program on a daily basis. Let me tell you that there are far more female scientists at AVRDC than there are male scientists, so we practice what we preach, but it is something that we're concerned about. We're also very concerned at all levels from the Global Horticulture Initiative in terms of wastage. Too many vegetables are wasted in a post-harvest situation. This photograph of me taken in Niger is very typical of what happens in West Africa. It just gets stuff thrown on the ground, and maybe 10% of it or 15% of it is saleable later, but it's clearly not a model which we'd like to follow. So now we have a question, we have a quiz here. You have to tell me what is the world's most popular fruit. Do we have anybody willing to make an answer? Yes, sir.
Banana, someone said it again.
Close, but it's actually tomato. That's a bit of a con, but if you look at the data here, we can see that in terms of production value, tomatoes are quite considerably above banana, but also fresh vegetables come in the category. These statistics don't mean a great deal, and they can be manipulated, but nevertheless, it's a bit of a fun question. One thing that's absolutely clear is that Africa is going to be a huge market for vegetables and fruits in the future, and that's why GlobalHort is interested in trying to promulgate the message within African and South Asian and other developing countries, because it's extremely important for children's nutrition. And economically, it's going to be a huge market that can be processed. However, most countries in the world do not, in fact, either produce or eat enough fruit and vegetables in their diets, and certainly not many of them reach the sort of World Health Authority recommended levels. Sub-Saharan Africa is very poor, South Asia is not very good, etc., etc. So the scope for improving people's diets, increasing the volume of vegetables and fruits available, remains very high. And this is particularly the case in Africa, where we have high proportion of the population is young. Young people need properly balanced diets, and in many cases at present, Zambia, Malawi, Niger, Mali, Burkina, large amounts of malnutrition being present. And if you remember nothing, remember this. I've shown this to Christian before. This is vegetable availability in grams per person per day. This is child mortality under 5. So as you fall to 200 grams of vegetable per person per day, child mortality rapidly rises. It doesn't have to, because here is the Philippines, this particular green dot. But if you go away from child mortality and go to stunting and reduction of IQ, you can see that in the case of the Philippines, they're way up there. So let's not kid ourselves. The amount of vegetables and fruits available to everybody's diets is extremely important, not only to your mortality, but also to your morbidity and how you can get your brain to develop and all these other things. Malnutrition is a very serious issue and not one which we can afford to take lightly. And in particular, we must not take lightly with young women. AVRDC and GlobalHort are pushing a message that the nutrition community has not yet taken on board. The 1,000 Days program, in which we have to give preferential treatment to pregnant and nursing mothers, isn't long enough. We need a 3,000 Days program, and needs to start when girls are 14. Because if you get pregnant, it's too late to start having a proper diet. You have to have a proper diet for several years beforehand, so that when you get pregnant, you don't pass that on to the next generation. So women's diet, and particularly teenage girls, is a message I want you to remember. It's extremely important. Much more perhaps than young children even, adults or these other potential disadvantaged groups. It is young women that is the key to this. And here's the evidence for it. This is the amount of nutrition required in the first trimester of pregnancy. You have from the staple cereals essentially nothing. You have from the pulses a fair amount of being provided. Unfortunately, for westernized vegetables like cabbage and tomato and others, you get almost no nutrition at all. Shock horror. But what you do get your nutrition from is from the indigenous green leafy vegetables that are important components of people's diets in the developing world. And these are being lost, and seed not available, whatever else you want to say. This is extremely important. So if you want to avoid malnutrition in pregnant women and young babies, they need to change their diets to incorporate some of these things. And what they don't want to do is to change their diets the way it's happening in Southeast Asia at the moment, that is following the Western model of high fructose drinks, lots of oils and carbohydrates in their diet, because that is the way to, in fact, promulgate obesity, and obesity almost as soon as possible brings type 2 diabetes. Here is the American government's version of what you should be eating. That's fine, except the plate is much too big. And they need to deal with that. And finally, the Americans are beginning to appreciate they have a real problem with obesity and health. They spend billions of dollars solving their health problems, and they could do much better by trying to deal with the problem before it starts rather than after it's become. And here in the Philippines, we have a Let's Eat More Indigenous Vegetables campaign, which is on the TV with actresses and sportsmen and things, which is the right way to go. And so we want to also push the fact that many of these indigenous vegetables, like Hibiscus sabdorifer, an important vegetable of the Sahel, it's the highest level of vitamin C of many vegetables that we know. In AVRDC, we're producing high beta-carotene tomatoes. Tomatoes can be extremely vitamin A enriched, but won't be if they're red. You have to have yellow or orange tomatoes, green leafy vegetables in Africa, African eggplants. There's all sorts of opportunities now to improve people's diets if you're willing to eat slightly different things. And in fact, in the developing world, people do that. It's only here in the West we have a fixation with cabbage and various other things we need to be aware of. Here is the indigenous vegetable component, and you can see in many of these countries, large proportions of indigenous vegetables are in people's diets. And in fact, if you're poor, the poorer you are, the more indigenous vegetables you have in your diet. Now, that means that as people become richer, we don't want them to stop eating some of these things. We want them to continue eating some of these things. Likewise, if you have vegetables, you have to know how to cook them properly. If you just boil the hell out of amaranthus and then throw all the water away, most of the goodness is gone. So cooking, what we call home economics in the US, they call it that. Anyway, learning how to deal with food product at the scientific level is a very important discipline and now is largely marginalized. And when you do these types of things, food also has to be attractive. There's no point in telling people to eat more vegetables. Tell your teenage daughters to eat more vegetables. They don't like it. Okay, so therefore cooking has to be well organized, it has to be colorful, it has to be attractive to the eye, it has to be attractive to the nose, and it has to be tasty. So all of these things make this challenge much more difficult than perhaps boiling rice or whatever it happens to be. We're dealing with a sophisticated commodity that has to be dealt with in a fairly sophisticated way. And the means for providing varied diets exists very often in the hands of women. In all of sub-Saharan Africa, in much of South and Southeast Asia, home gardens are women's business. And therefore, to help them to provide seed packs with appropriate distribution of vegetables for women in home gardens. My colleague here worked in Bolivian home gardens, okay? But this is important, but in most cases it is poo-pooed as being not important research. It certainly isn't up there. But I believe that providing women with the right sort of seeds to be available to grow their home gardens, not hybrids, but open pollinated varieties that they can save, can be very successful. In Bangladesh, we've had good success with that. It's not just home gardens, it's also community gardens, hospital gardens, prison gardens, army gardens, community gardens, you name it. They're all variants on this particular theme, and they not only are good for people's health, but also good psychologically. There is a dimension of which people that deal with gardening get a good feeling about that, and there's good collaboration amongst the community. And if you grow a 6 by 6 meter garden, which is represented here in the Indian example, devising the right mixture, getting the right planting times, all of these things become important scientific issues which have to be resolved. It's not easy to get the answers from textbooks. Then if you do this type of gardening, you can make a very substantial contribution to people's nutrition. So in the case of vitamin A supply, for the Indian example, this is in Jharkhand, you can have all the year round, all the vitamin A you could want from a home garden, and you don't need to supplement at all. But what we do have to do is to teach women like this how to cook, and what to cook, and when to cook it. Now you'd all think this is simple, they already know, but in many cases these are new vegetables people haven't tried before, they don't know what to do with it. But in Jharkhand, vegetable consumption, the production was up to 5 kilos a week, 3/4 of it approximately was consumed at home, and they felt that they were now eating a large proportion of vegetables in their diet. And you need to have charts like this which show you when to grow stuff, in what rotation. All of this is complex science which comes across now in an attractive way, but believe me, it takes quite a lot of experimentation to in fact devise a system of vegetables so that people have sufficient nutrients all of the year if possible, or if not 3/4 of the year. What we don't want is a situation like in Mali, where they get all of their vitamin C from mango and it lasts for 2 weeks of the year. And then for 52 weeks of the year, they don't have any vitamin C at all. And cooking and understanding the chemistry of food becomes extremely critical. In the case of mung bean, and probably 35% of all of the Indian population eat mung bean dal every day. Yes, they get their protein from it, but the key variable is what is this as a source of iron and zinc, particularly for young girls. Now, if you cook that dal with some tomatoes, so it's slightly acid, with perhaps some Chinese cabbage, you can triple the amount of available iron which women ingest. Okay, and for many people, the amount of iron is not how much you eat, but how much you ingest that becomes the key variable. And so therefore cooking becomes an extremely important component, and also which vegetables you're trying to grow together. And in the case of schoolgirls, AVRDC trials some years ago now have shown that the effect on mung bean is very, very positive. Mung bean is one of those pulses which has a much better protein distribution than others, and certainly can liberate its iron into the human system. Now you may ask yourself, all right, where am I going to get all these seeds from? Which ones do I select? Well, the AVRDC Gene Bank is a unique institution, has something over 61,000 species now, accessions now. But the key variable is this number here, 436 different species represented in the gene bank. That means wherever you're working in the world, I can find you a vegetable, if not 5 vegetables, to be able to grow there. And that's what makes this gene bank absolutely critical. And it also makes it rather difficult to manage growing out of these particular number of species hard, and several of the species are quite intransigent in terms of seeding, germination and other things, so we need science to help us to manage this gene bank and to take full advantage of it. And therefore I'm advocating that we start to now think beyond Norman Borlaug, beyond the Green Revolution. Okay, we've had 50 years of the Green Revolution. It hasn't solved the problem. Okay, and I believe that investment now in a much greater range of crop diversity makes a lot of sense. If we continue to make our research investment in maize, wheat and rice, as we're doing at the moment, then we are in fact asking for trouble. And we're going to get it if we're not careful. Don't feed the world and then not nourish it at the same time. Actually, I think feeding the world is largely dealt with now, if we're honest with ourselves, but nourishing it is not dealt with. And that's something we have to deal with. And we also have to deal with people who have imbalanced nutrition. Poverty and obesity are now highly correlated, and these become issues that we have to address sensibly. And if we're concerned about poor people, and I'm sure everybody in this room is concerned about poor people, particularly smallholder agriculturalists, then Global Horticulture Initiative is saying that growing vegetables and fruits is a potential pathway out of poverty. For several reasons. First of all, you don't have to have very much land in order to grow these things. It's not that you need hundreds of hectares. If you grow maize, wheat or rice, yes, you need 10 or 20 hectares to be able to grow yourself out of poverty. But if you have a hectare of vegetables, you can be a rich man. And if you want to be rich, it's not just the people on the farm, it's all the way down the vegetable production chain. Storage, transport, marketing, post-harvest, all of these issues helps to develop people's income sources, particularly for women. Women are the ones that participate in most of these activities on a worldwide basis. So if you're concerned about gender issues, then here's a way of investing your money in a way in which women will benefit most from. And the evidence for this improvement of income can be seen in quite a few different ways. This is results of AVRDC trials in Jharkhand, in the Punjab, and other type things. Net housing can almost pay for itself within a year of growing stuff in the Punjab. Income hugely increased, yields substantially increased with new varieties of mung beans, of yard-long bean, etc. Being able to grow an extra crop in a time when people would have been fallowing is another way of improving income. Introducing a new crop like vegetable soybean, as we'll see in a minute, can be a very important component. Differences, very hard to get figures here, but in reality you could probably get somewhere between a 25% and a 100% increase in income by growing vegetables rather than rice. If you want to provide employment for landless people, for family labor, then horticulture is a way in which this is made much more available, and it's not just weeding in the field, it's driving trucks, it's creating vegetable stores, it's marketing vegetables, it's delivering vegetables, it's adding value by having restaurants, etc., etc. And as you've seen in terms of employment, here a range of different countries, virtually all of the people involved in packing and processing and secondary addition of value to vegetables almost exclusively tend to be female. And if you are now a politician based in a rural environment, you know, if you want to in fact transform your rural economy by commercializing, you're never going to do that through the staple series. But you may be able to do that by, in fact, encouraging horticulture sector. Because horticulture requires so much additional infrastructure in terms of markets, then it becomes something that can develop the rural economy as a whole. So here's an example of this. For rice, most rice is traded over the farm gate. Therefore, you don't have a structure which is developed to be able to market it other than a truck arriving at the farm. But for vegetables, almost all of them are done in a market. So if you're going to sell vegetables, you have to have markets. If you have markets, then you start to have roads. And when you have roads, then you have to start to have some internal development of the economy. And many people say to me, well, you know, people grow vegetables and most of them are sold and they don't consume them at home, and therefore it's not helping in terms of malnutrition. So we did a survey some time back now in Cameroon outside of Yaoundé, and we asked the 300 farmers involved in this, or 300 people, households involved in this, what were their sources of livelihood in peri-urban Yaoundé, and you can see a range of different things here. But the really important bit is that most people are growing peri-urban gardens for marketing in Yaoundé's infrastructure. It becomes a very important part of their economy. And therefore we need to consider also what they grow and why they grow it. We ask them which vegetables you grow and what you do with it. And you can see here that in the case of nightshade, for example, which is a standard green leafy vegetable, most people grow that for home consumption, not so much for sale. In the case of capsicum, it's the other way around. But the logic for that is it's probably much easier to take capsicums to market, sell them because they look attractive. There's not too much difficulty in keeping them for 2 or 3 days. For nightshade, green leafy vegetable, it's a real challenge to get it to market. It's also a challenge to make sure that it's in good shape. But most people said they do a bit of both. And I think that's the reality of the situation, that when people grow home gardens, certainly in my experience, that you always give some to your neighbor, to your granny, to your niece, or whatever it happens to be. You sell a bit maybe if you're lucky, and you take home the bits that you can't actually sell, and therefore you have some in the home garden as well. And if you can help in terms of production by producing vegetables off-season, you can then have a huge potential impact. Now in Bangladesh, it's really impossible to grow tomatoes in the wet season because it's very hot and wet, a lot of viruses and diseases, and the rain itself hammers the crop. So if you can introduce these plastic rain shelters, which we did, then you still have to deal with the constraints, lots of pests and diseases, very high temperatures, etc., etc. But the end result is that you can raise the amount of money you make for every kilo of tomato from 10 cents a kilo to 50 cents a kilo, or even higher. So in fact, those farmers who have been willing to invest in very simple technology, just some plastic sheeting, some bamboos, and getting them erected in a way in which they stay up for the season, are laughing themselves all the way back to the bank. This is both men and women, and this has been a really important intervention because now tomatoes can be available in Dhaka and other places year-round, being produced locally in Bangladesh. Seed remains a problem, no matter where you happen to be it in Africa, or in Southeast Asia or wherever. AVRDC doesn't tend to produce its own varieties, but tries to get the private sector to produce varieties. They prefer only to produce hybrids, but in many cases they are willing to sell open pollinated varieties which are AVRDC bred but released by the private sector. In East Africa, these particular rather now quite elderly varieties are AVRDC bred but are sold by a range of different private sector seed companies. But when we talk about private sector seed companies in East Africa, we're not talking about Syngenta and Novartis with hundreds of employees. We're talking about East African seeds as like four senior employees and maybe 250 women doing the seed sorting. So this is important. And the amount of seed being sold now of AVRDC bred material, be it either directly bred or with half of the genetic makeup being from AVRDC, is starting to rise quite quickly. But we also understand that there's policy implications involved in this. We are heavily behind the African Seed Trade Association, trying to get them to convince their governments to have legislation which differentiates vegetables and fruits away from maize-sweetened rice, because there's enough. Kenyan maize industry is big enough for the seed sector to be able to make a market, but the tomato industry is not enough. So we need now East Africa to act as a whole so that they can in fact then develop a seed trade which is profitable and allows them to continue to help develop new varieties. We've signed an agreement with the African Seed Trade Association recently, and there was a special interest group formed in Mauritius. A couple of months' time now in Tunis. We're going to have another meeting with AFSTA, and hopefully they will start to begin to provide funding to support AVRDC and even GlobalHort. And the same goes with the Asia-Pacific Seed Association. When asked, 75% of companies say, yes, we use AVRDC germplasm. When we ask them for their seed sales and for details of what they use in the hybrids, because we're not allowed to know the commercial secrets. So we have really struggled to show our results because, in fact, it gives away information to their competitors. We also need to work very much on the agricultural economics dimension of this. So we need better markets. How can we go from fairly insanitary wet markets? Do we have to go all the way to the supermarket stage directly? Is it a one-step process or is it a 2- or 3-step process? Much of the governments are looking to advice from people like GlobalHort how to do that. We also have representatives here of the indigenous vegetable community. Here is an example of one which has been successful over the years. 15 years ago, most of the African eggplants were thorny, bitter, undeveloped, etc. But in the case of new varieties produced by AVRDC, DB3, that's been released as a variety in Tanzania and is being used as a hybrid parent by Reichsfarm Seed Company. Farmers are now starting to make quite a lot of money. If you're getting $1,000 a hectare from a vegetable, then you're now starting to talk about people that have substantial amounts of money. And in this case, most of the people involved, again, are women, but notice men are starting to creep in now because it's a profitable enterprise. And you can also see this freely for sale and available in Nairobi and Arusha and Dar and other places. And likewise in the supermarkets. And the importance then of how some of these new vegetables can be cooked, because not everybody likes a slightly bitter eggplant. You can have sweeter ones, you can have more bitter ones, depending on what you want. Eggplant is a problem because everybody wants something different, so it's quite difficult then to provide a universal equation. But here is an indigenous vegetable that is receiving some breeding and therefore potentially some market success as well. Here's another, this is interesting. AVRDC has the world responsibility for vegetable soybean. It's a big crop in Japan, in Taiwan, in these sorts of places, everybody eats vegetables, soybeans, salted with beer. It's a snack essentially for drinkers. Now we introduced this into Jharkhand. This is a tribal community. Almost nobody can read and write, and they'd never heard of the crop before. They didn't know how to eat it or what to deal with it. But what happened was that after 2 or 3 years of investigation, suddenly the thing took off. And now 50,000 farmers are growing this particular crop, and they are in fact dealing with it as dal rather than as green. We're happy about that. That's what they want to do. That's fine. Some of them eat it, as you see, as a vegetable, some roast it, etc., but at least half are going for the dal equation. So you never quite know how people are going to use these things, but they need to have a chance to be able to sort it out for themselves. Bitter gourd, a crop which many Germans are familiar with, but which is now taking off in a big way in Bangladesh. I was amazed when I went to Jessore to see how many hectares of bitter gourd were growing all over the place. This tastes quite disgusting, let me be frank about it, but is of value to you in terms of your diet because it has beneficial effects on the amount of blood sugar you take up and therefore the amount of insulin your body is producing. So if you're a pre-diabetic, as I am, because I'm somewhat obese, then under those circumstances, if you can include bitter gourd into your diet, you're doing yourself a favor, because potentially you can stave off diabetes for a bit longer. The other thing is that if you're unemployed, and there are plenty of unemployed people in the developing world, then how much does it cost to create a job? I mean, in manufacturing, what costs maybe $100,000 to create a single job, something like that. But if you can train people to become horticulturalists, as we did with 300 unemployed school leavers in Tanzania, total investment, I think, in the whole of the project was like $250,000 divided by 300 people. We don't yet know how many of them will have lasted as becoming entrepreneurs, but we provided them with training in bookkeeping, how to grow stuff, some seed, a bit of tools, etc. Potentially, you can have huge numbers of people available to become horticulturists, because you don't need much land, and there's plenty of land available for renting if necessary, even in a peri-urban environment. And so when you're thinking about growing stuff in urban environments, it has to be creative. There's all sorts of bits of land, bits of area, bits of sunshine, bits of water which can be used. If you want to be able to grow vegetables or fruits, you can do so. And likewise, if you're concerned about disaster relief, in our case in disaster recovery, if you can have seed packs available of, like this, of these 6 by 6 meter home gardens, then you can hand these things out through various NGOs, and it's not GlobalHort or AVRDC doing it, it's Catholic Relief Services or World Vision or wherever it happens to be, then these things can be useful to people in disaster recovery situations. So here's an example of USAID that got Catholic Aid, the Catholic Relief Services, to hand out these seed packs in Odisha, in northeastern India. They had flooding problems. I think 15,000 seed bags were handed out, and we understand that more than 90% of the people that received the seed pack grew them out in the first year. I don't know what happened in the second year or third year. We'd like to try to find out, but it doesn't matter. For me, the fact that 90% of the people grew them in the first year means it's valuable to them, and it was of some benefit. Climate change. It's real. Sorry about this, folks. But this is AVRDC headquarters. This is the rate of change of annual average air temperature from 1975 to 2011. An average increase of somewhere over 4 degrees centigrade per 100 years. This is one of the highest globally, but it's what we're showing at our farm. I trust the data. There's no doubt about that. On the other hand, if you look at Rothamsted Experimental Station in the UK, over the same time period, you get a curve that looks a bit like that, around 4 degrees C per 100 years. If you look at it over the full run of Rothamsted from 1875, you have a very small increase. So what I'm trying to tell you is that the time period over which you make this assessment actually is rather important. And it's not possible to compare one data set with another if one starts in 1930 and the other starts in 1975. And if you happen to be in Çorum, in Turkey, you have currently global cooling. So there is variability from location to location. There's also variability in over the time period. If you want to read more over about 40 or 50 sites, Keatinge et al. 2012 will provide you with that information. It's not that global warming isn't happening, it is happening, but it's variable and it's definitely different from place to place. One of the range of problems we have with vegetables is that people overspray and overspray and overspray, particularly for eggplant, cabbage, cauliflower, etc. It means that in fact most consumers, particularly in India, are being poisoned by the product that's being created. Now as horticulturists, GlobalHort, we can't have this. So we have to have now good IPM solutions. Christian has been working on this in the past with us, but it is extremely important. Don't use the wrong pesticides or insecticides. Try to follow the instructions. This is AVRDC's most distributed publication by quite a long way. Thousands, probably more like 10,000 copies have gone out now. This is the other thing you need to avoid. Don't process your vegetables in a post-harvest way with lots of dirty water in a peri-urban environment, because all you'll do is add eggs and worms and other things to your vegetables. But this is a common enough site, so you can grow them all very well, but if you then wash them in dirty water, it's not helping. Just about come to the end here, I want to just dispel a myth for you before I go. Everybody believes that if they go out jogging, they're going to lose lots of weight. Sorry to have to tell you that's not going to happen. What we did do is we got this young lady, who's one of our staff members, to go into the gym. She tried various machines over various time periods. We measured the amount of energy she was using. And we also got her to grow a 6 by 6 meter home garden, and we measured the amount of energy she was using. Well, the good news is this, that if you work for 1 hour a day for 2 months in the vegetable garden, your energy expenditure is very high. If you go onto the treadmill, it's about 1/3 of your energy expenditure. So if you actually really want to lose weight and you want to use energy, you want to exercise, and you want to eat well, and you want to eat diversely, grow your own home garden. Because you have every chance then of, in fact, achieving the end result that you wanted to. So I'd just like to thank the University of Bonn, ZEF, GIZ representative is here, all my other allies, Christian and many other people in this room. We're all fighting this battle together. It's not just Dino that stands up here and says, you got a problem with malnutrition globally, let's go out and solve it. I can't solve it. Professor von Braun can help, Christian can help, Wolfgang can help, many other people can help, Detlef can help. And by supporting Global Horticulture Initiative, which is now represented here in ZEF, you have a chance to be able to do that and to bring about the AVRDC mantra, which is bringing prosperity to the poor and health for all. Thank you very much.